This is The Chris Berry Show. Expert information on wealth, estate, and tax planning for the second half of life. Information that you can understand. Here's your host, Chris Berry.
Welcome to The Chris Berry Show. Hopefully you had a great week and you'll make it a great week this week as well. I like to start the show every week with a positive focus. So something positive that happened in the previous week. And it's something that I do with my family every night. We go around the table and share something positive that happens. Great way to start any type of meeting or event or a radio show. And so this week, my positive focus was that I was able to complete my materials for a continued education program that I was asked to present on. So it's through what's called National Business Institute, and they offer continued education for CPAs, attorneys, and financial planners. And so they have me presenting two different seminars coming up in March. One of them is going to be a national webinar, so going out to attorneys across the nation, talking about Medicaid, estate recovery, and asset protection trusts. And then also in March in Lansing, I'm going to be presenting to other attorneys for continued education on Medicaid planning and the use of asset protection trusts in Medicaid planning. So kind of similar topics, slightly different bent, one focusing more on the estate recovery side of things, the other focusing on planning for Medicaid, kind of pre-planning for Medicaid. So I thought it'd be interesting to maybe share just kind of big picture. I'm not going to share everything because one of the continuing education programs is 8 hours. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the details, so I don't want to bore everyone. But I thought it'd be important to share why these asset protection trusts are important and how we use them, because education is important. And there's a lot of attorneys, financial advisors, CPAs that don't quite understand how these specialized trusts that we're using, how they work and how they're different than just your basic revocable living trust. So I thought I'd share kind of big picture, the difference between a revocable trust versus the types of asset protection trusts that we're using in our practice called a castle trust. So I thought it'd be important to share why we use these different types of trusts, because most people just assume that there's only one type of trust. So we're going to spend some time on the show starting off with that topic. And then I'm very excited to have a guest, Lauren Kovac, with us again this week, and she's going to come in our second segment and talk to us a little bit about Alzheimer's awareness, Alzheimer's Association, but more importantly, she's going to share some of the news or the advocacy that she's participating in and that she's working on to help bring awareness of Alzheimer's and pass some important bills as it relates to Alzheimer's. So she's going to share with us about her upcoming trip to Washington, D.C., as well as to the state capitol, really trying to get our lawmakers to focus on Alzheimer's disease, which Alzheimer's, if you don't know, it's actually the sixth largest reason why cause of death for individuals in America. And if you're over the age of 65, it's the fifth largest cause for death. So it's something that we don't have a cure for yet, and that's why raising awareness, raising funds, and trying to get lawmakers to take a look at Alzheimer's is so important. And so Lauren is going to join us in our second segment. And then our third segment, we're going to get into some questions and answers. So if you do have any questions, you can email us anytime at askchris@thechrisberryshow.com. That's Berry, Berry with an E, not an A. So askchris@thechrisberryshow.com, or you can give us a call anytime at 810-355-2584. And we'll select some of those questions to go ahead and read on air, as well as give you some answers. Now, keep in mind, this is just general information. If you do have specific questions with regards to your planning and you want the appropriate answers, then it's important to maybe come to one of our workshops and sit down with someone in our firm. So what I wanted to start with, again, is just talking about kind of taking my continuing education materials that I'm sharing with other attorneys. I finally got it submitted and reviewed, so I can take that off my plate. Now all I have to do is worry about presenting, but they always want the materials a month or two ahead of time. So I got my materials in. That was my positive focus. I can take a sigh of relief that part is done. But what I thought I'd do is just share kind of why this is important. So what we're talking about are different types of trusts, and we're talking about qualifying for a governmental program that will help pay for our nursing home care. So why are we doing these different types of trusts? A little bit more complex. Well, what we found is that people don't just go from healthy to passing away anymore. They're going through this aging process, and they're developing things like Alzheimer's. And again, Lauren's going to talk to us a little bit about Alzheimer's disease in our second segment. But they're developing things like Alzheimer's or dementia or suffering a stroke and now needing long-term care. And if you don't know, long-term care costs can get pretty expensive, where if you had a loved one in a nursing home right now in Michigan, you're looking at paying anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 per month. And the average stay in a nursing home, according to current statistics, is about 2.5 years. And currently, 1 in 2 individuals are going to set foot in a nursing home. Those are just the current statistics. So given that if you're a married couple, look to your spouse, one of the two of you may need nursing home care to the tune of $8,000 to $12,000 a month. And so the question is, how do we go about paying for that? And we've talked about different ways to pay for long-term care. We've talked about that on the Chris Berry Show a number of times. But it's an important question that we have to answer: is how are we going to pay for long-term care? Because we're living longer than ever. With this added longevity, long-term care costs are one of the biggest concerns for a lot of people as it relates to retirement. And so how do we pay this $8,000 to $12,000 a month bill? Well, we can look at things like asset-based long-term care, where we plan ahead and we can allocate some of our money or leverage some of our funds to pay for long-term care, where if you have, say, $500,000 in your IRA, we could chip off $100,000 of that. Now that would be leveraged for a $300,000 death benefit, or if you're to need long-term care, $300,000 worth of long-term care funds. And that's great to pay for things like home care or assisted living, but you're going to blow through that for nursing home care pretty quick. And so that's where we look to legal planning, and we look to specific types of trusts as a way to shelter assets so that all of that money that you've worked so hard for, you can keep for yourself versus giving it to the government or nursing homes or long-term care costs. So this is where the types of trusts we use as it relates to protecting assets, it's different than your basic revocable living trust. So if you sat down with an attorney maybe a year ago, or maybe 5 years or 10 years, you did that estate plan, most likely what you have is a revocable living trust. So it's a type of trust that's great at avoiding probate or controlling the distribution upon death, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't really offer you any benefits while you're alive. It doesn't offer you any asset protection. Really, it's just a mechanism upon death to avoid probate and make sure your stuff goes where it's supposed to go. Versus a type of trust like a castle trust. And this is what we're doing the continued education for the other attorneys and financial advisors and CPAs. A castle trust is a form of irrevocable trust. And now sometimes that word scares people, but keep in mind, you can still change beneficiaries. You can serve as the trustee. But the specific type of trust, it's an irrevocable trust that is set up to protect against long-term care costs. So don't let the word irrevocable scare you. Again, you can make changes to it. You can change beneficiaries. You can change trustees. So there's still flexibility built into it. But what this trust does is as soon as you move the assets into the trust, what it does is immediately protects you from any type of lawsuits. So if you're to get in a car accident, whatever's held in the trust, because it's in the trust and not in your name, would be sheltered from the creditors. But more importantly, what this type of trust does is that it starts a 5-year clock, because we have this governmental program called Medicaid that'll help pay for the cost of care in a nursing home. But to qualify for Medicaid, a single individual can only have $2,000 worth of countable assets. A married couple, they're going to make you cut your assets in half. At most, you can have $120,000. So what this Castle Trust does is we move our assets into the trust, and then once we've made it 5 years, because Medicaid looks back 5 years to see if you moved any money around, then everything inside of the trust would be protected from that nursing home or Medicaid spend down. So what this means is that you can move your assets into the trust, and then if you were to need nursing home care in the future, you could have Medicaid pay the base level of care, and then a pot of resources available to pay for additional services to improve your quality of life. And then if you're a married couple, and one spouse needs long-term care in a nursing home, the other spouse does not have to be completely impoverished paying for that care. So let's take an example. Let's say that we have Jim and Judy, and they're both healthy, around retirement age, recently retired, let's say, and they have some assets. They've worked hard for their assets. They have a home. They have 2 children. They've put their kids through college. They've done all the right things. And now let's say that they're concerned about long-term care in the future. So what they can do, Jim and Judy, they could move their assets into the trust, and then once both of them, or once they've made it 5 years, everything inside of that trust could be protected from that nursing home or Medicaid spend down. Because now let's say that Jim suffers a stroke and needs long-term care. Well, if they hadn't done any type of planning, then Jim and Judy, they'd be paying out about $8,000 to $12,000 a month until they basically ran out of money. And then let's say Jim passes away, what's going to be left over for Judy and for the rest of her life? All that money that they've saved, that they've worked so hard to accumulate, could be gone very quickly at a tune of $8,000 to $12,000 per month. But if they set up a Castle Trust, move their assets into the trust, and then they've made it 5 years, 100% of what's in the trust could be protected from that nursing home or Medicaid spend down. And what that means is that Jim could receive the best care possible in a nursing home, and that Judy would not be completely impoverished just because Jim suffered a stroke and needed long-term care. So that everything they've worked hard for can continue to work hard for them. So that the money that they've accumulated, the wealth they've built up, wouldn't be lost to the government or long-term care costs. Because the important goal is to make sure that the money lasts at least as long as they do. So it's a strategy where we don't necessarily know what's going to happen looking into that crystal ball, but one thing we know for sure is that more and more people are experiencing the cost of long-term care. And unlike a revocable living trust that avoids probate and controls this distribution, what these asset protection trusts can do, like this Castle Trust, is give peace of mind to know that if you're diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's or suffer a stroke and now need long-term care, everything that you've worked so hard to accumulate can remain protected, and you can receive the best care possible. And ensure that if you are married, that there's something available for that healthy spouse. And then even if you want to leave a legacy and leave something for the children, there's a better chance that you'll be able to do that. And now this type of planning, it's going to be more and more popular, but there's not enough people out there that understand that this type of planning is possible, that we can protect assets from the government and long-term care costs. And so I think it's important to educate the public, and that's why we do these radio shows, that's why we do these workshops, but also just to get the other professionals on board with understanding that due to the longevity that we're all experiencing and the increasing cost of long-term care, that there's certain strategies available from a legal perspective, from a financial perspective, to try to protect assets, make sure the assets last as long as the individual does. So we're big believers in education, not just education to the public, but also education to those fellow professionals, where typically at least once or twice a year we'll do some type of continued education, or I'm asked to present for some type of continued education to other professionals. I'm asked actually quite a bit, but I can't say yes to all of them because I need to make sure that I'm best serving my clients as well, and I need to spend some time with family as well. But somehow, last year they asked me to do these 2 continued education presentations, and I said yes. So I wanted to share that because it is part of what we do. We're all about education. And so if you're interested in kind of more education on this topic and the difference between a revocable trust versus a castle trust, or do you even need a trust? I sit down with a lot of clients and there's no trust involved. But then if you are interested in more information on this topic and planning for the second half of life from a legal, financial, and tax standpoint, then we have weekly workshops at one of our different locations. So in February here, we have some workshops in both Brighton and at our Livonia office. So Livonia, we're going to be there February 21st at 2 p.m., and then another workshop February 28th at 6 p.m. And then in March, we're looking at having workshops that are already scheduled. And so if you go to thechrisberryshow.com, you can click through to a link that lists all of our upcoming workshops, and you can register there. But coming up in March, we're going to have some workshops in Bloomfield Hills, Novi, and Brighton. And we do these about once a week, and we try to limit the number of people to no more than 20, so that if you do have questions, you have a chance to have your questions answered. And the workshops are about an hour to an hour and a half, sometimes a little longer depending on the questions. And we cover the legal, financial, and tax planning tips for the second half of life, planning for retirement to make sure that your retirement is as smooth as possible, and trying to protect against the threats that could happen, whether it's long-term care costs, unnecessary taxes. So we talk about how with the current tax structure, there's some opportunity to save taxes. We talk about probate, and we talk about wills and trust, creating your own rulebook, and whether you even need a trust, because not everyone needs a trust. But it's a worthwhile workshop. People are always impressed with the education walking out of there. And join me in the next segment as we have Lauren and talking about the Alzheimer's Association.
The cost of care for an elderly loved one or a loved one with a chronic illness is shockingly expensive. If you are dealing with the unbelievable cost of care, make sure you get all the benefits you're entitled to. Here's certified elder law attorney Chris Berry from the Elder Care Firm in Brighton.
Most of my clients are really concerned about long-term care costs. They don't know where to turn, and what we can do is put together legal strategies to protect your resources and also bring in additional resources to help pay that cost of care. One of the things that they often say is that I wish I knew about this years prior. And unfortunately, the information's out there, but there's just so few certified elder law attorneys. As the only certified elder law attorney in Livingston County, it's my job to make sure that our seniors, our loved ones, our veterans have the best quality of care possible and the best quality of life possible.
Protect your hard-earned assets from probate, long-term care costs, and the IRS. The Elder Care Firm will get you the governmental benefits you deserve, including veterans benefits and Medicaid. Visit theeldercarefirm.com and schedule a free 15-minute phone consultation. That's theeldercarefirm.com.
Welcome back to the Chris Berry Show. Very excited to have a special guest, Lauren Kovac, and welcome, Lauren.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me back.
Yeah, so we had you a couple weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago on the show, and wanted to have you back. And last time we talked about Alzheimer's, we're going to talk about Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's advocacy today. But if you could just kind of remind us how Alzheimer's and advocacy and the Alzheimer's Association became a part of your life.
Sure. My mom and I were caregivers for my grandma, who I call Chupe, if you hear me refer her to that. That was my nickname for her. And Mom and I took care of Grandma at home for 15 years. We mostly did it by ourselves, but it definitely wasn't for a lack of trying for help. But that's what kind of led to all the advocacy work I do to try to fight for change in public policy and get that help for families especially.
Sure. And so just for our listeners, if they haven't listened to one of the shows before, what is Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer's is a disease that's currently in the top 10. It's the sixth leading cause of death and the only one in the top 10 that cannot be cured, slowed, or even prevented. A lot of people associate Alzheimer's specifically just with memory loss, when really it's so much more than that. It can really be a complete personality change, and in regards to forgetting, it's also their body essentially forgetting to tell them how to function at a basic level, how to eat, how to walk, how to breathe, even at the end. So it's...
Yeah. So what was the signs that you saw, if you remember back with your grandma, where,
you knew that something wasn't necessarily right?
Someone actually just asked me this the other day. What were the original signs and symptoms that you noticed? And I've now learned that an early sign can be falls. And when she was still independent and living by herself, I remember going over there one day, and she was sitting on the floor, and I said, Chupe, what happened? And she had no clue how she got there. So she said, I'm fine. And I said, well, what happened? How'd you fall? She goes, I don't know. And a lot of times in the earlier stages, it's repeating themselves. It can be even an hour later, they'll kind of tell you the same story or ask the same question. So we noticed a lot of that in the beginning.
And so you and your mom became caregivers for her, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And how did you learn about the Alzheimer's Association or first get involved in the Alzheimer's Association?
So it was completely by a fluke. It was probably 6 or 7 years into her diagnosis, and I knew that purple was the color of Alzheimer's, so I Googled like a purple Alzheimer's shirt. I thought, I'll buy something to kind of support, this disease, and came across the top hit was the Alzheimer's Association, and I had no clue there was an entire organization. Then that's where I learned about the Walk to End Alzheimer's, and then it all kind of took off from there.
Sure. And maybe you could share, what was your initial involvement with the Alzheimer's Association, or did they provide any help or support for you?
So I didn't really know what I was getting into. Typically, I like to educate myself. I admittedly did not in the beginning years with this disease. But the first thing I found back then, it was called the Memory Walk. So the next year is when it rebranded to Walk to End Alzheimer's. So Mom and I did this memory walk on 10-10-10, and that was our first ever walk. And it was just very inspiring that day to see that I wasn't alone. There's all these other people dealing with this Alzheimer's that I didn't know much about. And then I got the email the next year saying that, the walk was coming to Brighton, they were rebranding, and that's when I signed up to chair it.
Wow. And now, last year, I think the Brighton Walk, we raised over $178,000. And that's just one of the walks that are going on. I think there was 20, if I remember correctly, in the state of Michigan. But now your role's changing a little bit with Alzheimer's Association. So tell me how you're involved now.
So every year I would attend what we call the State Advocacy Day. And it's just one day. We meet at the Capitol in Lansing. We talk to local lawmakers. And I'd always known that there was this bigger, the National Alzheimer's Forum in Washington, D.C. And 3 years ago, I finally, the stars aligned, and I kind of got the opportunity to go. And that was advocacy on just a whole nother level. And to walk into a room and see 1,200 advocates and everything's purpled out, and talk about that feeling of not being alone, too. Those 3 days were probably the most inspiring and empowering days. And ever since that first forum in D.C., I said, I will never miss another. So
what goes on at the State Advocacy Days that you said you were attending? So
with State Advocacy Day, the two chapters combined, the Greater Michigan chapter and the Michigan Great Lakes chapter, and we all meet up and they sort you kind of by where you live, your district. And you meet with representatives more at a state level to talk about state issues. Michigan historically is extremely underfunded. We actually currently have nothing in the budget for Alzheimer's care. So actually just yesterday a group went to Governor Whitmer's office to ask that we be kind of included in her State of State, which is coming up, and then also we're asking for $2 million for the state of Michigan.
Okay. And if someone wants to get involved on the state level, how would they get involved?
So best way to go is always to look up www.alz.org, and you can type in your zip code there, and that'll plug you into your local chapter.
Okay, all right. And then at the national level, tell me a little bit about Forum. What was your experience the first time you went?
So first time I went was the year in which my Chupe was still living. So I think it was a little different experience for me. It was very hard being away from her because even she passed away a couple months after I got back. Yeah. But we lined up caregivers, and even my mom said, you need to go to this. We'll be fine at home. You need to go. So in that first year especially, we were asking for, we pushed for certain Alzheimer's bills to be passed. And that first year that I went was called PCHETA. It's the acronym. It's the Palliative Care Hospice Education Training Act. And a couple months before we left, Mom and I had finally gotten that help that I advocate for and that I talk about so much for families. And we actually had a very negative hospice experience. Especially going to Forum, like I talk about, it's really not about politics. It's just about sharing your story. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty powerful to go and share that story and kind of feel like you are making a difference.
Sure, yeah. Now, did that bill end up passing?
So unfortunately, that bill did not pass. We got some exciting news, though. At the beginning of this year, we actually passed what we call the Bold Alzheimer's Act. Mm-hmm. And in record time, it was probably I believe it was just about a year from when it got introduced into Congress, we got that bill passed.
Sure.
And then just about a few weeks ago, we got the text alert that PCHETA was being reintroduced into the House right now. So when we go to forum this year, which is March 31st to April 2nd, that's going to be our big ask. We're pushing for PCHETA again.
Awesome. Great. So now you mentioned this BOLD Act. Can you talk to me a little more about that?
Yeah. So what they did is the Alzheimer's Association, along with some senators in Congress, congressmen and women, introduced this bill which creates the largest infrastructure for Centers for Alzheimer's Excellence. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a way to prevent people. We're trying to prevent hospitalizations for Alzheimer's patients, which I know, personally speaking, when we had to do hospitalizations with CHUPE, it was just detrimental, taking them out of the routine, and it's really a big setback. So this builds this infrastructure for doctors to all work together no matter where you go, kind of to help establish this database for Alzheimer's patients.
Yeah, and can you maybe expand on why it's difficult or detrimental for hospitalizations for someone with Alzheimer's?
I mean, in my opinion, they're so big into routine. Routine is so good for them. Mm-hmm. And I know when we would go into the hospital, it was taking them out of their homes, mm-hmm. which was the biggest thing, taking them away for a few days from their environment, from the people they're used to seeing. And I mean, Mom and I would stay with her 24/7 when she was hospitalized. But then that transition back home, mm-hmm. it was almost like we needed a home health care staff to help us back at home because there was just such a massive decline. Mm-hmm. And so you just take like 10 steps back after a hospital stay.
Sure. So is the idea with this bill that now there'll be resources where better to keep her Alzheimer's patient at home then?
Yeah, absolutely. So that doctors can communicate better between one another no matter where the patient's going mm-hmm. or where they've been, and to try to more treat them outside of, to avoid these hospital stays.
Okay. All right. And with this, the other bill, the PCHETA bill, that's addressing hospice, you said?
Yes, okay. And we're not the only, I don't want to say disease, I should say the only association that's backing the bill. This will help all hospice patients, essentially, and really pushing for palliative care and better training for these healthcare professionals. Sure.
And maybe could you talk a little bit about your hospice experience with CHUPE?
Yeah, so that one I mentioned just a couple months before Forum, we finally got approved for hospice, which we had been trying for a long time. And back in the day, hospice was this big scary word that meant imminent death. And but now it's a lot more common. You can get it many months beforehand, and like this palliative care that I'm talking about. So we finally got approval for it. They were a no-call, no-show for their initial assessment. So I said, all right, we'll give them a second shot. We're just happy to have help. And we got this call at 2 a.m. On the home phone that they were delivering her morphine. And I said, well, it's what? I mean, nothing was imminent. It just, everything seemed a little off. And then we got a visit from the social worker, which is routine. It's part of your hospice team. And during this visit, she just seemed very judgmental, very kind of condescending with the way we were caring for her.
Sure.
Never once even visited CHUPE the entire stay, which really bothered me. And I didn't like the way, I just got a very bad feeling from it. Sure. And then the next day we got a knock on our door, and it was Adult Protective Services saying there was a abuse and neglect complaint filed against us. So just the irony of me being the advocate that fights for this help, and then just such a slap in the face. So
that's unfortunate, and especially the role of a caregiver, you need all the help and support you can get. And so that's great news with the BOLD Act, and hopefully PCHETA can get through as well. Now, getting involved in advocacy, you're dealing with politicians and that type of thing. Did you enjoy politics before you got involved in this?
No, not at all. I'm just like the average person. I hate politics. And
Yeah. So if someone wants to get involved, is this taking up a lot of your time, or this advocacy?
I mean, for me, I put a little more into my time because I enjoy it and it's rewarding for me. But there's, like I'm the ambassador to Senator Stabenow just because of where I live.
Sure.
But we also have what we call ACT members, Alzheimer's Congressional Team members.
Sure.
So these are team members that, with Senator Stabenow, it'd pretty much be anybody that lives in the state of Michigan can help.
Yeah.
And it can be as simple as sending an email, tweeting. You can go visit your member of Congress, a phone call, but you're a volunteer. It's all in your own time, and it's how much you want to put into it.
Sure. And if someone does want to get involved, what's the best way to take the first step to get involved in the Alzheimer's Association or advocacy?
And that's the first thing I would do is reach out to your local chapter. And sometimes it can be tough if you've never shared your story before. So, like I said, if you want to do these simple, auto-populated messages that you can tweet out or email. But, if you're ready and you want to share your story, the Alzheimer's Association, your local chapter, can help you set up those meetings where you can talk face-to-face and really, really get into and share your story.
Sure. And you mentioned there's opportunities both on the state level as well as nationally to get involved?
Yes. Yep. Our State Advocacy Day this year is coming up May 7th.
Okay.
So we could use all the volunteers we could get.
Okay. And so May 7th is the State Advocacy Day?
State Advocacy Day, yep.
And contacting the local Alzheimer's Association would be the best way to get involved?
Yes. Yep. And our public policy director for the entire state of Michigan, her name's Jennifer Hunt.
Okay. All right. And then on the national level, if they want to get involved that way?
Actually, same thing would be to reach out to your local chapter, and then they'll get you in touch with Jennifer Hunt, who will help kind of guide you. There's scholarships available through your local chapter that can, DC's not cheap, so.
Sure, yeah. Now, meeting these politicians, was it kind of scary the first time at all, or?
It actually was, because you have this idea that they, make the laws, and they're these big, powerful people. And I cannot tell you how many people I've now met, members of Congress over the years, where I sit down, and you meet with staffers a lot of the time, too. These politicians are extremely busy. I cannot tell you how many times we sit down, and they kind of start the conversation with, my dad has Alzheimer's, or my grandma passed away from Alzheimer's. So it's like, they already understand. Everybody knows somebody that has been affected by this disease.
Yeah, so it sounds like on both sides of the table, they're pretty receptive to the message.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yep.
And so I guess you're kind of in a unique position of, on one hand, going through this with your grandma, and then on the other hand, working at it from an advocacy standpoint. Is there some common thread that you see in your service? Because it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is service. You're doing service to your grandma and helping out your mom. Now you're doing service to all the other people who are going through that same position that you were in. Has it been personally rewarding for you?
So I actually say my volunteer work is kind of selfish, because when I was doing it when she was still alive, that was a way to help me cope. So I guess there's two ways of looking at it. You can be frustrated at the hand you were dealt, or you can take that pain and turn it into action, as we say. And once you've lived through it, why not help all the other families that are going through it? I know you see a lot of families affected by this, and it's hard to sit back and not do anything.
Sure. Yeah. And so, and I appreciate you sharing that. And as we're wrapping up, I want to thank you again for your service, the service to your grandma, the service to all the other families who are dealing with this Alzheimer's disease. Again, what's the best way if someone does want to get involved, either at the state or local level, in terms of advocacy?
I would visit www.alz.org, and there will be a place right there that says Find Your Local Chapter. You can put in your zip code, and you'll find everything, whether you want to sign up for advocacy, whether you need a local support group. All of it's right there on that website.
Okay. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for being part of the show again. We appreciate it. Look forward to having you on, having you tell us all about the exciting news, and hopefully PCHETA passes. So
thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And stick with us. Thank you.
If you or a loved one is facing long-term care costs, make sure you talk with certified elder law attorney Chris Berry from the Elder Care Firm, like Jennifer did from Howell.
This past summer, my mom had to transition into a nursing home. So we contacted Chris to help get things in order. You know, I wanted the best. I wanted somebody who knew what they were doing. Chris was able to help save a lot of that money that my mom and dad both worked so hard for. I thought that everything would have to go to the nursing home, but it didn't. He was able to save us half of everything that would have gone if we hadn't contacted the elder care firm. And we're all happy about that. Don't go to the nursing home without contacting Chris first.
Hello, I'm attorney Chris Berry. The elder care firm is here to help you and your family find solutions. Call us today.
Protect your assets from probate, long-term care costs, the IRS, and get the governmental benefits you deserve. Visit theeldercarefirm.com today or call 810-214-3800. 810-214-3800.
Welcome back to the Chris Berry Show. So hopefully you enjoyed that time with Lauren. Alzheimer's, it's a scary disease. And also, speaking of Alzheimer's, we just set up the Walk to End Alzheimer's, our walk page. And I'll have a link. So if you want to learn more about the Walk to End Alzheimer's, or if you want to take a minute to donate, last year for our walk, we raised over $178,000 to go to the Alzheimer's Association, going to raise awareness, going to advocacy, going to finding a cure. So if you do want to take a second, you can visit thechrisberryshow.com, where we have a link where you can go to the walk page. So if you want to join our team, last year we raised over $12,000 for the Walk to End Alzheimer's. As a walk as a whole, which we were on the committee organizing, we raised over $178,000. So you can take a minute to join our team, maybe join us for the walk, or even if you could donate maybe $5, the cost of a Starbucks coffee. Every little bit helps, and it goes to a good cause. Again, the Alzheimer's Association. So with that, now I want to get into our question and answer portion of the Chris Berry Show. So this is where we have opportunity where if there's questions that our listeners submit via email at askchris@thechrisberryshow.com, or you can give us a call anytime, 810-355-2584, or on our website there's a spot where you can click through and ask the question directly there. So the first question is from Jackson here. As a power of attorney or a medical power of attorney, what am I allowed to charge? I've been acting as a power of attorney and as a medical power of attorney for my cousin. Am I allowed to charge any type of, am I able to charge for my time? So, Jackson, with regards to the medical power of attorney, you're not allowed to charge for your time. You can be reimbursed for expenses, but part of the statutes in Michigan for medical power of attorney does not allow you to charge for your time. Now, that's different with your financial power of attorney. So there's two key kind of disability documents. We have a medical power of attorney that allows you to make medical decisions for the person who've appointed you. In Michigan, we call this a patient advocate designation. Then the second key document, and really anyone over the age of 18 should have these in place, the second key document is a financial power of attorney. And the financial power of attorney is the document that allows you to make financial decisions for the person who's appointed you. So with the medical power of attorney, you're not allowed to charge for your time, but you could be reimbursed for expenses. For example, if you were just serving as a medical power of attorney and you had to take an airplane flight to get bedside next to the person you've appointed, theoretically, you could maybe expense that. As a financial power of attorney, you can be reimbursed for your expenses, but also depending on how that document is written, you might also be able to be compensated for your time. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to look at that financial power of attorney document to see what exactly does it allow or what does it not allow. Because often there will be a paragraph, and you have to read your own financial power of attorney here, but often there would be a paragraph that says that the person you've appointed or the person that's appointed you, you as the power of attorney, you could be compensated or take reasonable compensation. So typically it'll say you can take your expenses, but then also it might say you can take reasonable compensation. So if you did want to keep track of your hours, you could take reasonable compensation based on those hours. hours. I'd just keep very good records because that's something that easily could be challenged by maybe other beneficiaries named in a will or a trust or other individuals. But that reasonable compensation, there's no hardline rule, but typically maybe $20 to $25 an hour. If you are a professional, like a CPA or something, you could charge more. But you would be entitled to reasonable compensation under the financial power of attorney, Jackson, as long as the document allows for that, but not under the medical power of attorney. So if you're serving for both, then you are going to take compensation. Make sure that it's flowing or from that financial power of attorney, and you need to make sure that the financial power of attorney document actually does allow for that. So again, whenever someone asks kind of questions like this, I always say you have to check what the document allows, because that's creating your own rule book. And that's why that's basically what an estate plan is a rule book. And that's why a lot of times in our workshops, we call an estate plan a rule book. And that's where we like to start with a lot of the planning, because first we need to create that rule book, and then we figure out kind of the assets and taxes based on understanding that we have a rule book in place, because you want to rely on your rule book versus relying on the government's rule book. And if you don't have a power of attorney, you don't have a trust, you don't have a will, then you're leaving everything up to the government to decide your fate. So it's important that we have that structure that's created by that estate plan, created by that rule book. Then we can look at optimizing things in terms of making sure that your investments match your volatility, make sure that we put together a tax plan of how are we going to pay taxes in the future. But a lot of times we like to start with that rule book, the estate plan. So I always start with, what does the document actually say? So take a second and read that financial power of attorney, or read that trust, or maybe not read that trust, depending on how thick it is, because it can be pretty dull reading all that legalese. And if you want to know dull, you should get a copy of the continuing education materials I had to put together for these other attorneys. Now that was rough. That's some rough writing, and that's some rough reading. But we try to save the legalese for the other attorneys and advisors. We try to keep things as simple as possible in our workshops and for our clients. Now, the next question: how do I do an informal probate in Michigan? And this is from Larry. My mom died in May. In her will, it states that I'm the sole heir and representative. And in the will, it directs an informal probate. I've never filed. I just figured this out while I was doing her taxes. Well, Larry, I'm not sure if a probate is going to be required, even though the will says to do an informal probate. So I think it's helpful to understand first how assets transfer upon death, and then it's important to understand the different types of probate. So, Larry, in your situation, a probate probably will not even be required because understand that when someone passes away, you don't always have to open up a probate, even an informal probate. So what happens when someone passes away is 4 ways that assets transfer out of someone's name upon death. And the first way would be through joint ownership. So let's say your mom passed. Let's say, Larry, you were named joint on a checking account with her. Well, guess what? When she passes away, because you were named jointly, now that checking account goes to you. Second way assets pass or transfer upon death is through beneficiary designations. So let's say your mom had an IRA or a life insurance policy and she's named you as the beneficiary. Well, when mom passes away, then that asset transfers into your name. Now it's yours. Third would be through a trust. So I'm guessing she doesn't have a trust, whether a revocable trust or an asset protection trust like a castle trust. So, but if an asset doesn't pass through joint ownership, beneficiary designation, trust, then it's going to end up going into probate. And that's what we want to try to avoid, because it's a court process, it's time consuming, and even if it's an informal probate, you're looking at the statutory minimum of at least 5 months before that probate can be wrapped up. So ideally, Larry, in your situation with mom, hopefully she can avoid probate so that you don't even have to worry about whether it's an informal or formal probate. Now, what I didn't mention is a will. And a lot of people think a will avoids probate, but it does not. What a will does is gives instructions to the probate court on how to administer your estate. So if you're looking at avoiding probate and controlling your distribution, you're not going to want to rely upon a will to handle your affairs. You're going to want to rely on something like joint ownership, beneficiary designation, or trust. And in our workshops that we do about once a week, we talk about the dangers of joint ownership and the dangers or missed opportunities of just relying on beneficiary designations. There's a lot of things that could pop up when you're talking about joint ownership. Joint ownership, it's great for a married couple, but I wouldn't recommend naming anyone else joint on your accounts or assets. There's a whole slew of things that could go wrong, both from a liability standpoint, a long-term care standpoint, and from a tax standpoint. So joint ownership is great for married couples, but I wouldn't recommend naming anyone else jointly on your accounts. So now that we understand how estate administration works, where if the asset doesn't pass through joint ownership, beneficiary designation, trust, then it ends up going into probate, then you need to understand that there's different types of probate. And so first, we look to see if there's a will or not. If there's a will, then we call that dying testate, meaning with a will. If there is no will, then you die intestate, meaning you're relying just on the government's default rules of how assets should pass. But first, we look to see the size of the estate that's going through probate. So if there's less than $20,000, then you can probably do what's called a small estate affidavit procedure, meaning that the estate is so small, basically what the probate court will do is let you wrap it up within a day, and basically they're just going to distribute the assets, whatever asset goes through probate, they're going to distribute it to whoever paid the funeral home bills. And so if there's less than $20,000, probate's not a big deal. You still have to take a trip to probate court. There's still filing fees that have to be paid. So it's still a pain in the butt that you'd want to avoid. But if it's less than $20,000, typically you can do a small estate affidavit procedure. Now, if it's more than $20,000, then you're going to have two options. You're going to have the option of formal probate and the option of informal probate. So most wills direct for, if possible, informal probate. And what that means is that it's more of a streamlined process. You don't have to go in front of a judge, and you're really working with a county probate register. So you're just kind of working with the workers at the probate desk versus kind of going to court, getting in front of a judge, that type of thing. So most estates, if they are going to go through probate, go through the informal probate process. Occasionally, they do go the formal probate route, and now you're going to get the judge involved. And typically, when things get a little messy, maybe there's some beneficiaries fighting, then things get knocked into formal probate. But I would say a majority of the probate would be informal probates. So, Larry, hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully you don't have to go to probate court at all. But if you do, you might be able to wrap it up in a day with that small estate affidavit procedure. But worst case, that would be the informal probate that's going to be, by statute, a 5-month process versus the small estate affidavit procedure, which could be wrapped up within a day. So hopefully that was helpful, Larry. Now, our next question is from Shelby. So she's thinking about her estate and will. She's single, has no kids, and she wants to provide for her dogs after she's gone and can't take care of them. She's done a Google search and found pet trusts, pet agreements as a possibility, and she writes in, I'm not sure what to do. How do most people handle this issue? Well, Shelby, thank you for that question. It's a common scenario. So, and we've done a fair share of pet trusts. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll set up a trust just like any other trust to avoid probate and control that distribution upon death. And then what we'll do is we'll appoint someone as a trustee, or you would appoint someone. So Shelby, you'd pick someone that you'd want to take care of your dogs. And what happens is that we would allocate the trust funds to be used for the benefit of the dogs. So, Shelby, let's say you have a friend, Sarah. You say, okay, I appoint Sarah as trustee of the trust for the benefit of my animals, my dogs. And then Sarah would manage that money for the benefit of the dogs, using it for food and shelter and all the things that the dogs need, veterinarian bills, etc. And this could work for dogs, cats. A lot of times people will set this up for horses, especially animals that have a longer lifespan. And we've done our fair share of pet trusts. And then one of the key things to take into account is if those pets were to pass away, where would the money go afterwards, after that pet has passed away? So a lot of times people will name charities like the Humane Society, different types of animal rescues. I was working with a client a little while ago, and we were wrapping up her trust, and she carved out some money to take care of her cats. And she had 2 cats, and then if the cats were to pass away, then whatever was remaining would go to a rescue shelter where she actually gets a lot of cats. So it's something to think about, especially if you do have pets. Obviously, if you don't have kids, you want to make sure the cats or dogs were taken care of, or your pets or your animals were taken care of. Animal trust is a good option. There was a while ago a woman, Leona Helmsley. She had a dog named Trouble, a very rich individual, owned some hotels, I think. But I want to say she left over $2 million in a pet trust for the benefit of her dog. I think the dog's name was Trouble, if I can remember correctly. This is just offhand. So you can leave $2 million to your pets if you want to. That's certainly an option. So pet trust, something to think about because we love our fur babies, right? So we want to make sure that we take care of them. So hopefully that was helpful, Shelby, as well as our other questions that were submitted, and hopefully to our listeners as well. Hopefully you learned something. And if there's something, a question that you have, feel free to email us or give us a call anytime. We love those questions. We love our listener interaction. And I want to thank everyone for listening this week. I hope you have a great week. I look forward to talking to you next week. And again, if you're interested in some more information, want to learn more, ask questions live, then I invite you to attend one of our weekly workshops. We have some workshops coming up in Brighton and Livonia in February, and then we're moving on to Bloomfield Hills, Novi, and Brighton in March. Make it a great week. Take care. Look forward to talking to you again next week.
Learn more about Chris Berry and how he can help your family by visiting online at thechrisberryshow.com. That's thechrisberryshow.com. You can also call Chris Berry at 810-355-2584. That's 810-355-2584. This program content reflects the opinions of Chris Berry and his guests, not the elder care firm, Prosperity Capital Advisors, or the C.J. Berry Group, and is subject to change at any time without notice. Content provided herein is for informational purposes only and should not be used or construed as investment or legal advice, or a recommendation regarding the purchase or sale of any security, or to follow any legal or tax strategy. There's no guarantee that the strategist's statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Indices are not available for direct investment. Any investor who attempts to mimic the performance of an index would incur fees and expenses which would reduce returns. All investing involves risk, including the potential for loss of principal. There's no guarantee that any investment plan or strategy will be successful. We recommend that you consult with a professional dedicated to your needs. This program is furnished by the Elder Care Firm.